Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to the GM. It is your guy, Boulanger. Let's talk. I know all of you have heard, or at least most of you have heard, the Todd McShay and EDC interview, and I'm sure you've heard some commentary on that interview. And so what we're going to do in this particular video, we're going to listen to a few clips from EDC. We're going to break down what we actually hear, and then we're going to lean into if he gave some clues on what this roster would look like for the next season, and could anybody be leaving? The reason why we're doing this is because after the Super Bowl, we're actually going to put on our GM hat, you and me together, and we're going to pretend to be EDC based on his words. And after the Super Bowl, we're going to go dark. I won't make any new videos next week, so whatever you hear will already have been recorded. And when we come back, we're going to be full go on free agency and the draft. So with no further delay, let's take a listen to what EDC had to say.
As the fifth quarterback in that class, what did you guys see in Lamar, and what is memorable still to this day as part of that process, and how you landed on him and decided, you know what, he's still there, end of the first round, let's trade up, let's go get him. He can be our guy.
Well, I first think it goes back to just the fall evaluation. And we had a couple scouts, Milt Hendrickson being one, Dwan Jones being the other guy. They went into Louisville that year, came back, and basically this guy's a special athlete. And this guy can do a lot of things that are unique at our level of football. Now, there's some things to work on, of course, like all players, but he's a unique player. And so, I watched him. Joe Ortiz, our college director at the time, watched him. At some point, we brought him to Ozzie. Ozzie looked at him. I would typically bring players to Ozzie to look at. He and I have always worked together in the draft for 25 years before I became GM. And so, he became a player that we were very interested in. The challenge for us was Joe Flacco was still our quarterback.
Right.
And, they're very, very different. And how do we add a player like Lamar and not take away from Joe or change the offense dramatically? So we were fortunate that we had on staff that year, Marty Morningweg and James Urban, both guys that had coached Michael Vick. And so they had an experience with a mobile quarterback. They understood, what types of plays Lamar would flourish in. And they love the skill set, but the whole challenge, he's so different from Joe Flacco. And we looked at it like, okay, we have the traditional pocket passer with Joe Flacco. Lamar is dynamic in his own way. We think he's going to get better as a pocket passer. How do they coexist? How does our offense coexist? What's it going to look like? And what players can we add around those two guys to make both those guys be successful? And so that year, what I remember most is Lamar did not have an agent. And it was, we wanted to bring him into Baltimore. We're very secretive in Baltimore. We don't want to be connected to players. So never really, if you see us connected to a player, that probably means we're not connected to that player.
We've learned.
So I don't ever want to be connected to anybody. So the challenge is, how do we get Lamar Jackson to come visit us in Baltimore? We didn't bring any other quarterbacks in that year. We did like some quarterbacks. We figured they wouldn't be there when we picked.
Right.
So we felt like Lamar might be the one guy that had a chance to be there in the 20s when we picked. One of my jobs as a scouting director at that time was to assess league value. How do other teams feel about these players? That's a big part of my job. It still is. And I felt like Lamar would be there in the 20s, maybe in the 30s, but definitely in the 20s. And so how do we get him? We brought him into Baltimore. The nice thing about a player that doesn't have an agent, there's no leaks.
Yeah.
Right? No one knew that Lamar Jackson spent a day and a half with us in Baltimore. I got one call from somebody in the media. They said, I heard Lamar Jackson might have visited you guys. I said, no. Can you prove it? Why do you say that?
Yeah.
He goes, well, I just kind of caught rumblings of it. I said, well, if you want to report it, you can, but you might be wrong. I'm not going to say one way or the other. Well, it turned he did spend the day with us. So at some point then, as we got closer to the draft, the idea was to get as many picks as we could, to trade back as many times as we could, either take Lamar or draft another player, but have a backup plan we might get back in.
Yep.
And Howie Roseman's a guy that, he always makes trades. He loves to make trades. He and I have made a lot of trades together. We're pretty active on draft day, mostly going back. And, I learned from the Joe Flacco trade. We had the 8th pick. We went back to 26 and went back up to 22. We got Flacco. That if you assess league value, you can go back and still get your quarterback.
Right.
And so the idea was we're going to do the same thing with Lamar as we did with Joe. So we went, Howie was willing to trade. We went back. We ended up drafting Hayden Hurst because we went back and we went back again. We ended up getting 2/3 and a 4th as well. But Howie was willing to trade out of 32 and take our second, give us 32. So we ended up drafting Hayden Hurst at 25. Kevin Byrne, our PR guy, wanted us to go downstairs to the press conference. Kevin, let's just hold off. The scouts and coaches, they thought we were done. They thought we were done. So Ozzie would always sit at the head of the table, still does. I sit to his right. Steve Bisciotti's across the way, talking to John. They're high-fiving, they're happy, whatever. I looked at Ozzie and I go, let's call Howie. And he said, you want to? I said, yeah, let's call him. So I call Howie. Howie says, I want to do it. So I looked at Ozzie. I said, get Lamar on the phone. Ozzie called Lamar. I'm on the phone with Howie. We did the trade. We turned it in. No one even knew in the room that we were doing it. No one was paying attention.
That's wild.
And all of a sudden I go, hey guys, we just got Lamar Jackson.
So yeah, in this first clip, you hear Todd McShay and EDC discussing how the Baltimore Ravens ended up with Lamar Jackson in that 2018 draft. And I find it super interesting that EDC reveals that Lamar Jackson was the only QB that they brought in that offseason. I clearly understand how they like to keep things secret in Baltimore, for sure, keep it close to the vest. And EDC kind of leans into the idea that it was mostly him who had the idea of trading back up into the bottom of that first round and selecting Lamar Jackson. And so if it was his idea, then I'm going to lean into my thoughts on some of the mistakes they may have made in that 2018 draft and how that has played out as we have come forward. When you are evaluating a quarterback, in my perspective, let me be clear, in my perspective, you either like him or you love him, right? I'm only leaning in those two directions. I either like a quarterback enough to bring him in and I love him enough to take him. So if the Baltimore Ravens liked Lamar Jackson enough to bring him in, somewhere in those conversations, in their evaluation, they loved him enough to take him. That's clearly what EDC lets us know, is that we thought that he would be available in the 20s in the first round. But it was clear that they didn't really want Lamar Jackson per se, because when you had an opportunity to take him at 25, you took Hayden Hurst, which lets me know one or two things. You really didn't want him, or you had a poor evaluation process that offseason to where you couldn't foresee the uncovering of this talent. I get it. You needed a tight end. I get it. You were building the roster for Joe Flacco. I get that part. But if you liked him enough to bring him in while already having Joe Flacco, then you take him at 25. With understanding the whole NFL expert world, quote unquote, was saying that Lamar Jackson was a project at best at quarterback and he should transition to maybe wide receiver. He should transition to maybe running back. But you drafted him to be a QB. You brought him in for his evaluation to be a QB. So when you took him, that's what you knew he was going to be. And so it's just baffling to me why you would take a tight end, and if he was your quarterback, you run the risk of 7 additional picks passing and somebody else having an opportunity to take him off your hands. That is the reason why I don't trust EDC. See, I had leaned into it being mostly Ozzy. But now that I understand that it was EDC's idea, right? Then why didn't EDC let's take him at 25? Because here's a real truth. If you jump into that second round and you go down to see what the Philadelphia Eagles did with the Baltimore Ravens pick, guess what they took? They took Dallas Goedert, who is a better tight end than Hayden Hurst and on par with Mark Andrews, a tight end who eventually took over for Zach Ertz, and a tight end who is preparing to play in his second Super Bowl. When you look at Dallas Goedert versus a Mark Andrews who they took in the third round, there's not a whole lot of difference. They both have some athleticism. They both have some speed for a tight end. They both have catchability, all those kind of things. I just wonder what life would have looked like if you go Lamar Jackson and then if you go Dallas Goedert, how that changes the rest of the draft, what that would look like. I don't know that it would be much different. Or what other options would you have had if you held on to your second round pick? You see, because obviously you had Hayden Hurst evaluated too high. Also, because Dallas Goedert is the better tight end. Mark Andrews is the better tight end. But you tell me that you took Hayden Hurst over Lamar Jackson. You see, that is what's very clear to me. And I think that is a part of what keeps the Baltimore Ravens paralyzed with being able to fill out a complete roster. You see, EDC also discloses that he learned some things from Howie Roseman. I guess mostly how to move up and down in the draft. But I guess he should have went to the Howie Roseman School of Roster Construction, because Howie Roseman had just come off of a Super Bowl, and he's now in his third Super Bowl collectively. So maybe EDC should have took some additional lessons besides just how to move up and down on draft night. But let's not stop there. Let's listen to another clip where EDC discusses his thought process after having Lamar Jackson.
Your guy, and a couple of years in, a year or two in, he's the guy.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, what is your thought process as general manager? What are you thinking in terms of how do we best support Lamar? Is it put a great defense around him?
Mm-hmm.
And not even just the personnel, but also how do we get him to a position off the field? Like all the different aspects that come with supporting a superstar quarterback. Can you kind of take us through that a little bit?
Yeah, so you try to figure out what he does best, and then what kinds of players he likes to throw the ball to. And so in his case, it's actually coincidental, but also, we were lucky that he loves to throw to tight ends.
Yes.
Right. So we had drafted Hayden Hurst, ended up trading Hayden, but Hayden and Mark Andrews.
Yeah.
Right.
So he had these like really comfort pieces for him, and then offensive line wise, and so that same draft class, we drafted Mark Andrews and we drafted Orlando Brown, and we had Ronnie Stanley and Kevin Zeitler. We built an offensive line around him that suited what we do, which is run the football. We believe in having good backs, so we added backs. We added Mark Ingram that first year. We drafted J.K. Dobbins. We signed Gus Edwards as an undrafted guy. But over the years, Justice Hill is a good player for us now. Derrick Henry. We've always had like multiple backs.
Yeah.
That we can rotate and guys to be productive. And we've tried to add. Always try to add speed to the field. We feel like Lamar being the type of player he is, he presents so many challenges for linebackers in the front. Getting guys outside. So we drafted Hollywood. We drafted Zay. We drafted Bate. We've allocated a lot of resources. We don't have that. The one piece we probably missed on is that big X presence. We've never really had that. We've tried to find that guy. That guy doesn't go on trees, right? Find those kind of guys, right? That's probably the one thing. But for us, it's always been, okay, offensive line, first and foremost, keep it strong. Now, we made some changes this year. We had some guys leave, but I think the line this year, we ended up pretty good. But we allocate a lot of resources to the offensive line, running backs, tight ends, and receivers. But then also, I think on defense, we've always been a stingy defense in terms of preventing the run. Okay, we're a ball control team. We like to control the ball. 4 minutes, 6 minutes, whatever it is. We want to make sure if we get to the fourth quarter of a game, we have the lead. We're tough to play against.
Yeah.
We want to choke the other team out, basically. We run the ball, take our shots downfield, but control the clock. So part of that is not letting the other team control the ball. Right, so we have a strong defensive line. We stopped the run as best as we can. Our secondary wasn't that great this year, as good as it could have been. It came on in the second half of the season. But what we saw this year with Lamar and the growth of Lamar is we became a team this year that could come back from double-digit deficits, which we've never really been. We've morphed under Todd Monken and all the different things that we do offensively. Lamar has improved every year as a passer. We've added more talent around him. The line's doing their part. And we went from being a very run-centric offense to being a very balanced team this year that can score in many different ways.
Yeah, when you listen to this clip, you hear Todd McShay say, okay, after a couple of years, you realize that you have your guy. And I wonder, did they even recognize that they had their guy? Because after a couple of years, that would have been 2018 season, 2019 season, both of which were playoff seasons, one of which Lamar Jackson had won the MVP. Did they really know what they had? You see, I think EDC has convinced himself that they did something roster-wise that really supported Lamar Jackson. See, because when he answers the question, he doesn't answer in a 2-year context. He answers in a context that spans over the entire time that Lamar Jackson has been in Baltimore. But I want to narrow it down to just those first 3 years. I'll give him a little bit of grace and go 3 years. Okay? You did not draft Hayden Hurst and Mark Andrews for Lamar Jackson. So don't put that together. Do not put that together, because it was very, very clear Lamar Jackson was not going to be the first-year starter until Joe Flacco went down. It was very, very clear the roster, the offensive line, the wide receivers, all of those components were built up for Joe Flacco, not Lamar Jackson. So let's just get that out of the way. Now, in that second season, yes, you did go get Marquise Hollywood Brown. Yes, the Baltimore Ravens have absolutely acquired through draft and I guess you could say free agency some wide receiver talent to help out Lamar Jackson. But don't say that this roster was built for Lamar Jackson. Don't say, oh, Orlando Brown as building around Lamar Jackson. Orlando Brown was drafted in the same draft as Lamar Jackson. He just so happens to be on the board and have Baltimore Raven connection based on his dad. He was drafted to do what? Protect Joe Flacco. Because the truth is, you didn't even expect to get Lamar Jackson. How do we know? Because you didn't take him when he was on the board at 25. So this whole draft was set up to supply Joe Flacco with what he needed to be successful, as should. But don't kind of contextualize it as you did all of these things with Mark Andrews and Hayden Hurst and Orlando Brown for Lamar Jackson. That's not true. That is not a true statement. And also what EDC goes on to reveal is the one thing that he can own is that they have not been able to get that big X receiver. Well, you know what he could have done? He could have learned from Howie Roseman. When they needed that big X receiver, what did they do? They went and traded for that big X receiver after already drafting Devontae Smith. That's what you do, according to Todd McShay's question. After a couple of years, you knew you had your guy. After a couple of years, when the Philadelphia Eagles felt they had their guy, they continued to build around him. They built the offensive line, okay? They built a really good receiving corps. So EDC is telling something that's not true. That 2018 draft class was not drafted for Lamar Jackson. That wasn't happening until 2019, okay? He mentions Kevin Zeitler. That was a part of what they did for Lamar Jackson. Well, if I'm using the 3-year context, 18, 19, and 20, Kevin Zeitler didn't get to Baltimore until 2021. So yeah, you might have added Kevin Zeitler, but that wasn't because after 2019 season, you knew what you had. In fact, if we can be honest, they didn't add any real offensive talent until they drafted Roger Rosengarten as it pertains to the draft. Go back and think about the guys they actually drafted to help out Lamar Jackson. Ben Cleveland, I think, was drafted in 2020 in the 3rd round. He never really saw the field. Kevin Zeitler was a free agent signing in 2021. But there has been no left tackle drafted from 19 up until the 2024 draft. There has been no right tackle drafted until last year. There was no left tackle drafted nor right tackle drafted until this past draft. There hasn't been a viable left guard drafted high in the draft. So this narrative that they've been building around Lamar Jackson is a false narrative. What he actually says, right, I think without even recognizing that he's saying it, is that, oh, we need a defense too. When you look at the capital that they've put into the defense, that's what they've done. And they call it helping out Lamar Jackson. They put $100 million in Meta BK. That they put $100 million in Roquan, plus the draft capital it took to get him. They put $70 million into Marcus Williams. And then they put guys who are already predating Lamar Jackson. They put $100 million into Marlon Humphrey. So it sounds like the real building was not offensive. It was only defensive. See, because they did bring in guys, free agents, wide receivers like Dez Bryant. What was he going to do with Dez Bryant when he was past his prime? What was he going to do with Deshaun Jackson past his prime? What was he going to do with Sammy Watkins past his prime? All the guys who are no longer in the league. Is that what you call really helping out your quarterback? If you couldn't go get that guy in the draft to be that number 1 big body receiver, X receiver that he refers to, then you could take a tip from Howie Roseman and just go get a guy. During Lamar Jackson's era, DeAndre Hopkins has been on 3 different teams. Now, I don't want him now. I would have wanted him 2, 3, 4 years ago, but not now. A.J. Brown was available, obviously. Devontae Smith has moved twice. He's 6'2", 6'3", if I remember correctly. DK Metcalf was on the draft board. You say, hey, big body receiver. Okay, big body receiver. Then you talked about adding speed. Well, DK Metcalf was both. He's a 6'3" guy who runs a 4.3. He was on the board. He was on the board when you took Hollywood Brown. I'm just saying. Make it make sense, EDC. You see, I've learned in what I do for a living as a clinician that when people talk, if you just listen, they'll tell you a real truth. See, I've learned to listen to what people say and also what people don't say. And what I've learned from EDC in this interview with Todd McShay is that he has some vulnerabilities that absolutely show up with clarity over the course of his GMing. Let's take a listen to some of those things that EDC talked about when it comes to himself personally.
If you now, though, could look back to a young Eric DaCosta, just getting 24 years old, you said, right?
Mm-hmm.
Starting in the business, what advice would you give to him?
Realize that you don't know as much as you think you do about the game, number one. Because I'm still now, 30 years later, figuring stuff out, especially like X's and O's wise and like coaching related stuff. As scouts, we evaluate ability and talent, but a lot of scouts don't have any background in terms of X's and O's and what the player is supposed to be doing. So learn the game.
When you hear EDC in this clip, I think he says some things that are pretty telling. One thing I think he says that's pretty clear is that after 30 years of learning, he's never really perfected a real craft to general managing. Another thing I think he reveals is that he doesn't fully understand the X's and O's, which was advice he would give to his younger self, but I think it really speaks to his current situation right now. I think he struggles with X's and O's. Here's the reason why though. This interview, especially this clip, kind of leans into EDC approaches things like the draft, contract negotiations, free agency, more like a scout, not as a general manager. You see, a scout, as EDC spoke of very clearly, evaluates talent and ability, which typically leans a lot on analytics, which we know the Baltimore Ravens do, as revealed in this interview, that they have their own software for scouting, which is analytically based. I can get down with all of that. But when you're a general manager, you have to have an ability to understand the X's and O's at a depth to understand how the talent you are evaluating fits into your X's and O's offensively and defensively. That's why sometimes I believe players don't really fit or they don't really produce in the positions they've been drafted for, traded for, or signed in free agency. Let me give you a few examples. Marcus Williams was signed by the Baltimore Ravens pretty early on in free agency and made the highest paid safety in the league at that time. Well, analytics would say he has good height, weight, speed, good range, and he was quote unquote a ball hawk when you look at all of the numbers. But X's and O's would say he really didn't fit what the Baltimore Ravens did well, specifically because he had a previous injury history. I know this because I had been able to watch Marcus Williams down in New Orleans from day one. Another example is Roquan Smith, first round pick, big time talent, height, weight, speed, sideline to sideline, all those things are great. But let me tell you why I believe EDC traded for Roquan and then overpaid Roquan. It's because of his inability to really judge talent as it pertains to how it fits into X's and O's. He felt desperate, so he had to lock in Roquan at a high price because of fear that he would land somewhere else. You see, EDC speaks to, in another part of this interview, of how they lost CJ Mosley, which subsequently resulted in them drafting Patrick Queen. Well, Patrick Queen was not really a perfect fit for what they drafted him for. So then in desperation, now you have to make a subsequent trade several years later in order to finally get the right fit. But proper evaluation from talent and ability as a scout to X's and O's understanding then makes proper application for Patrick Queen or Roquan, so on and so forth. That's also why when you think about a Metabike who really had one breakout year, not saying he wasn't a good player, but he's not great like you've paid him. See, I think EDC gets hosed in contract negotiations simply because he salivates over what he can see talent and ability wise, but he's seems in some aspects to be unaware of what the production actually has been. See, Metabike, super talented, but he was never really productive but that one season, which is his contract season, which is how he got paid. Broderick Washington got paid on one season of production. You haven't seen him since. There are so many other aspects of the Baltimore Ravens and how players are getting drafted but not really being used. That's why you see double picks that go to waste. That's why you saw Jalen Armour-Davis and Pepe Williams get drafted in the same draft, none of which have been a contributor. That's why you saw, watch this craziness, that's why you saw in the same draft Charlie Kolar get drafted above Isaiah Likely. Both are super talented, but right now Isaiah Likely is the greater of the commodities. But so how would they have evaluated Kolar over Likely? Well, Kolar's bigger. Kolar's 6'6". He weighs a little bit more. But overall, Isaiah Likely is the better talent. And so I think that that's what they're seeing. EDC is approaching drafting, free agency, and trading from a scout perspective. Height, weight, speed, arm length, that kind of thing, versus what the guy's real true strength is. Because a guy can be big, tall, and fast, great arm length, catch radius, or whatever it is, but never really put it together. It really would explain why the Baltimore Ravens have spent a lot of draft capital picking players that never really panned out. Miles Borkins, for an example, a third-round pick, height, weight, speed, 6'5". He has good speed for a guy that size, but never really panned out in Baltimore. So then you go small then, right? Devin Duvernay, super fast, 4'3" guy, low 4'3" guy in fact, but never really panned out as a receiver in Baltimore. James Prochet, great hands, but whether it was for the Ravens or for another team, he's never really panned out. It's not a surprise why our guys that we pick don't pan out anywhere else, including on the team that we've been selected. They have not really been able to select a pass rusher that has been able to really pan out. Odafe is good, never will be great. Remember Williams, the edge rusher out of Alabama several years ago, drafted in 3rd round? I don't even know if he made the roster that year. David Ajabo, why did they draft him? As a scout, they drafted him on talent and potential, not recognizing that for at least one whole season, he would not be a contributor. And then after he got healthy, he still hasn't contributed. That's because you're looking at the guy as a talent from a scout perspective, not as a general manager. Tavius Robinson is a good pick, but you know what he is? He's just Odafe Owe 2 years younger. It's true. That's why when you look at how they've drafted linebackers, right? Drafted Patrick Queen, like I said earlier, but he wasn't really a good fit for what they needed. Not his talent. He had good height, weight, speed, but what they needed, they didn't draft in Patrick Queen. So then you turn around and you draft Trenton Simpson last year to be a Patrick Queen replacement. He has all of the stuff, good height, weight, speed, athleticism, sideline to sideline, but he played himself out of the rotation. That's because EDC is drafting as a scout and not as a general manager who can blend talent, potential, skill to what you're actually going to do, X's and O's wise. So let me know what you guys think, man. So listen, I got another video coming up. There's something else in this video with Todd McShay that I think leans into what we could see free agency wise in 2025, but it also will explain why EDC and John Harbaugh are linked together in perpetuity. I'm your guy Boulanger. This is the GM, and I'm out.